Yes. And, unfortunately, what you see a lot of times, and this is even, you typically have one spouse, whether it's transitioning to the next generation, the wealth, or whether it's a spouse, you typically have one spouse that handles everything, or that is the way it is in a lot of cases. And it becomes very difficult if you go into retirement with the same process. I think it's very important to have, communication is essential. It is the foundation of a relationship, I think.
Yeah.
And really, without proper communication, it just creates between money and communication, you can just throw it out the window in terms of divorce and just scorched earth, I would say. And
Hey there, and welcome to Money and You. I'm Michelle Perkins, your host. My search for more fulfilling work led me to career and business coaching, where I stumbled upon a game-changing discovery. Money issues often start with our mindset and habits. You see, our relationship with money is the key to overcoming those frustrating financial obstacles. As an entrepreneur, coach, and problem solver, I'm passionate about helping you create a great relationship with money. Because, turns out, that's the foundation for a limit-free life. Each week on Money and You, I speak with amazing guests about all things money, mindset, practical tips, and everything in between. We're here to give you new insights, education, and empowerment so money can be one of your favorite relationships. So join us for some lively conversations and let's transform your financial life together. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Money and You Show. I'm Michelle Perkins, your host. Very happy that you're here with us. I'm thrilled with how wonderful the guests have been on the show. And I have another one today for you. And so I'm going to dive in. We've been talking a lot about retirement. So whether, I guess whatever age you are, it applies. So don't run away if you're not even close to retirement. But if you are sort of getting there, this is especially important for you. So today's guest is Jeffrey Panik. What if your retirement plan actually fit your life and not just your spreadsheet? Today's guest, Jeffrey Panik, is a 25-year financial advisor. He's also a U.S. Army veteran and the founder of Balance Wealth Partners. Known for breaking down complex topics into real-life solutions, Jeff helps pre-retirees align their money with their values, goals, and family priorities. If you're feeling overwhelmed by Social Security decisions, Medicare puzzles, or succession plans, Jeff's here to make it all make sense. You'll walk away smarter and more confident about your future. Jeff, welcome.
thanks for having me, Michelle.
Yeah, so happy to have you. Do you like Jeff or Jeffrey better?
Jeff is probably better. The only person that ever called me Jeffrey was my mother when she was upset with me. So.
We won't go there. I don't like being confused with people's mothers, except for my kids. Okay, there's a lot here, a lot to talk about, and I'm really pleased that you're here. We've been having interesting, retirement. It sounds like it could potentially be sort of adult topic, but it's actually not at all. And I think a few of our guests have talked about and I talk about it all the time, how much our world is changing. And so this whole concept of retirement that we're kind of holding on to some old school ideas about it, and it's really transforming all the time into something very new. So I really think it's an important conversation as a somewhat older person. I also think it's, there's so much to it. It's so interrelated with everything else in our lives. And it's not a simple decision anymore like it was years ago when you worked for somebody for 40 years, looked forward to that day and you had your pension plan. And I mean, it's all so changed. So what are some of your, just general thoughts on retirement today?
I think, really it's, as you mentioned, it's not a one size fits all kind of plan. Everyone, every family, couple, individual, they have their own vision of what they want that to be. The concern I have with a lot of people, they just wait too long to develop the vision and they're in retirement and it's a very reactive process. The one thing that I try to focus on with people is to be proactive. As difficult as it may be, it's really, I look at it, you build your life over time, you get to retirement, and it's really, you have a big puzzle. And it's really a matter of putting that puzzle together. And that creates a lot of challenges, even if you think that you have the right guidance or the right direction.
And are you talking more about sort of what you're gonna be doing with your days in retirement, or are you talking more about from a financial standpoint?
I think it really comes together where you hit it on the head, where that's an extremely important component. It is important when you're walking in to know, at least have some idea of what you want to do. You know, you want to try out hobbies, you want to try out volunteering, you want to do these things before you retire, as strange as that sounds, so that you can have two or three things to really focus on. And I think unfortunately people wait too long, and then it just, things get away from them, unfortunately. And I think that is the most, just like you should have purpose while you're working in your life, it is just extremely important to have purpose when you retire. If you do that, I think you'll have a much more successful, happier retirement.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is a song I've been singing for a long time, and, I don't see retirement the same way because, um, I mean, I see it more like you're that chapter where you have the financial stability and foundational kind of support to go do whatever you want, I mean, maybe you were doing certain jobs because you were supporting your family or whatever, and now you can go and do almost anything you want. Those things that you dreamt about but never actually did.
Exactly. And I mean, with the benefit of the internet and just technology, it really gives you the ability. A lot of people, we call it like downshifting, where you can try retirement out, whether you like it or not. And you can transition really on your terms. And I think if you wait and delay just even getting a general idea of where you stand, it just creates a cascade of issues when, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you have a health issue or something that comes up where you're forced out to retire. And then it's very, as I mentioned, reactive process.
Mhm. Yeah, and reactive things are not good.
No, no.
We don't make our best decisions when we're just reacting to circumstance. So, if you make those decisions in advance, then, you have a roadmap, basically.
Exactly. And that's really what it's about, is building a roadmap out based upon your specific circumstances. And it's, as I mentioned, it's not a one size fits all. And, for many people, retirement in some instances can be longer than the period of time they were working. So it's really important to look and say, how can I get the most out of this time? Because you've saved your whole life, you've worked hard. How can you transition? And it may be you continue to work in a different role or do something different, but it's important to try these things out before you just jump right into it.
Yeah. What have you seen in your, long career, both on the like sort of a good example and a bad example of how people have dealt with this?
So the good example I use is I had someone a few years ago where they were retiring. They were an engineer. They were so focused on work, and they just decided, their hobby was going to be golf, because that's what he expected and that's what was thought. And so he went out, he bought golf clubs, he did all these things. He started playing golf and realized he hated it after he retired. And, it could have maybe tried it out prior, and really, it was a matter of kind of taking a step back and really looking and saying, well, what do I want to do? And it may not always be obvious. I mean, some of the things that are obvious are just spend time with your family, because that, for a lot of people, that can really escape them during their working years.
Yeah. As a woman, I know the other side of that too, where suddenly your husband is home all the time and you've had this whole life without them being there in the day.
And that gets into a separate story where I had another person that retired. They worked into their early 70s, and they didn't really have a plan either. And they reached a breaking point with their spouse, because the spouse came back from being out and looked at they were getting ready to start cooking, and looked at the spice rack, and their spouse had reorganized the spice rack based upon some sort of formula that he put together. At that point, it was like enough is enough. And, that gets really into couples. As you mentioned, with work, with family, with children, you're not around each other typically constantly. When you get into retirement, if you don't have hobbies, that's what's going to happen. And any issues that you had prior are just going to raise their heads, and there's probably going to be a fair amount of frustration. And that's why I think, it's important that each person really takes an assessment and really comes up with what goals they want, what they really want to accomplish in retirement, and then kind of work from there. And it doesn't mean they're the one of the spouses or couple, they may prefer to travel. Another may be just happy staying around reading. But what you want to do is communicate that, and just not have, you don't want one of your spouse to book a bunch of trips and you say, I'm not doing this.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm laughing and as you're explaining this, because part of me is just I'm hearing my friends talking about this exact thing. I'm meeting a woman at pickleball who's playing 5 days a week, and she's like, my husband retired and he's home watching TV too much. I have got to get out of there. I'm getting depressed, and so and I'm picking on the husbands. Obviously, it could go the other way, but it is a real thing. And when you don't have those conversations, and when you're still working, some of these things do sound, just perfect to be home all the time or to be on the golf course when you really don't. And you're right, that you haven't experienced it. You don't actually know how it's going to feel.
No. And I think the other thing is you really want to be engaged. I think unfortunately for a lot of people going into retirement, they just kind of introvert themselves. And that can create a cascade of health issues, memory. You just have to be around other people. And I think it's a great opportunity to really get out of your shell, retirement, and just meet people that have similar, I wouldn't say necessarily similar backgrounds, but are looking to try to expand their group of friends and work from there, and really have, whether it's this a couple having an individual, having an accountability partner, really someone that can kind of lay things out and say, well, it's easier often when the spouse says, I need you to get out. This isn't good. It's another thing when you have someone that is we would say a colleague or a peer, saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. You touched on such an important point. That your health is really at stake if you're going to isolate yourself or sit too much or, not engage your mind. I mean, these are real things that are happening to people, both, they're doing a really good job with it and they're feeling young at 85 or 90, or they're not doing a good job and they're falling apart in their 70s, so it's a huge deal. And from a retirement standpoint, financially, do you want to spend your money on fun classes and golf courses, or do you want to spend it on an assisted living place?
And it's difficult often to control, yeah, especially as it relates to memory. But really looking at about a 3 to 5 year window going into retirement, you really need to, if you haven't, get a physical, understand what health issues you may have. Look at your parents, and it's oftentimes people often say you become your parents. Really, it's a matter of assessing how their retirement was and probably making some adjustments from there, and just doing things to kind of focus more, as you mentioned, on health, because, doing just certain things will get you a lot further, and certain illnesses and disease you can't control.
Right.
But what you can do is you can be active, and, again, you've saved, tried to build as much as you can to get to the point where you can quit working in most cases. And the last thing you want is to just not be able to get out there and enjoy life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point of all this, sacrifice that you make as a saver so that you can someday retire. And yeah, I mean, I took care of my parents, and I remember my dad being, I mean, he lived for a long time, but then he lived for longer than he wanted as a sick person. And he was very vocal about the fact that this is not why I saved. I wanted you guys to have the money, or I wanted, whatever, but he didn't want it to go to all the caregiving and all of that. So
No, that's unfortunately with the healthcare system, the medications and just the ways they can keep you alive are wonderful in a lot of instances.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of people, if they had their way about it, they wouldn't live the life that they had, at the end. And just from a cost and just end of life, your family, it's very difficult. And anyone that's ever had a parent that has had dementia or you just feel for anyone in that position. And it unfortunately becomes more prevalent, I think, when you look at people now in their 40s or 50s. They're thinking about, how am I going to retire? But they have their parents and they're thinking, well, how do I manage them at the same time in their retirement? And it's just not something that anyone prepares for or plans for.
Yeah. So are you helping clients to prepare for that kind of thing, or kind of what is your focus right now in terms of all of this with people?
So I think what you have to be a resource. I think and one of the challenges I always say is, when I started in the financial services business, you had to reach out to someone to get information, or you had to go to a library or a bookstore to get a book. Now Google, you could get about 300 million hits on a basic financial topic. The problem with that, though, is everyone is very unique. They have different needs, whether it's if they have debt, they have children with special needs, what they're looking to try to accomplish. And so I just view it as very important. It has to be an individualized, holistic approach that takes health, that takes someone's welfare, and what they're looking to try to do really in their next great, their next great adventure, I would call it.
Yeah. And I love that, because people are living longer. So you do have an opportunity for this long, span of time that you can be very active in doing things. And, so it's not like it was back in the day when you were planning for 10 years of basically, I don't know what, but
No, and I think the other thing is really to communicate. And I always say it's very important, legacy planning, having a family meeting and just really communicating what your wishes are to your children, so they fully understand everything, and they can act on it. And it's whether it's an only child or whether you have three or four or five or however many children, it's important to let them know these things. What do you want at end of life? What do why are you giving a friend something that you're not giving them? The biggest thing I see is jewelry. There's just jewelry with it doesn't even have to be expensive jewelry. I've seen situations where it's very inexpensive, but really, because of the emotions around it, people will fight till the end over it. And, you kind of bring up money. Money can be a great resource and something that's wonderful if it's used the right way.
Right.
But it also, it can be very evil from the standpoint of friction and just destroying if it's not.
I've been shocked how many families I've seen sort of break apart over, it's not even so much, it's the whole managing of the estate, and, going through whatever there is there, the distributions of it, and or the caretaking of parents. One person typically does a lot more than other people. And it becomes it's funny. I mean, it's not funny, but the families have been so close and so tight for decades will like come apart in a year because of this stuff. It's
it's very difficult, and it's typically there's a triggering event. And I'm gonna use an example of myself. My mother, I was the only child. My mother, she had an accident, and she started having memory issues kind of right around the same time. And she was in a position where she was extremely independent, where it was like the last thing you would ever want is for her. The last thing she ever wanted was to be in having help, someone assisting her.
Right.
And, it reached a point where I had to put her into assisted living. And I always thought, well, at least I didn't have to worry about the decision process, because no one's going to say, this is what you did. But then you worry, you're like, well, maybe I'm making a bad decision. So it's just, you really want, again, there should be more resources, and there's not. And because mainly it's geographic, because one area may be completely different than another area, and different people have different spending, long-term care, all these things. And the more that you can have and understand every what is going on the front end, it makes it a lot easier because often there's very little time in terms of the decision process. It's like I have to put my parents somewhere, but I didn't really have to spend 6 to 12 months to think about it. Like if you're moving somewhere, I always say retirement. If you're thinking about moving, you probably need to rent a little bit, look at a few places. That's usually not the case when you're trying to find someone care. It's more of another reactive situation where you're just on your heels trying to do the best you can, especially if there's other siblings involved,
Right.
because, anything that's gone wrong in the past is going to probably rear its head at that point.
So true. Yeah, that's something that I haven't heard before, but it's so true. All these things that, you've sort of shoved down about how you're feeling about your siblings definitely surface at that time. So,
Yes.
yeah, communication is so important. One thing that I was very grateful for is my dad. My mom and dad were both sick at the same time, but my dad was, as far as his brain, he was in good shape, and he'd had a stroke. That was the crazy part of that. But he introduced me to his financial planner, and we had several three-way conversations. And he'd been a smart investor his whole life, and he had certain, protocols that he liked that he wanted, to continue. And it was so helpful to know her, to have these conversations. So part of what you were saying, then I didn't have to feel like, what if I'm doing something he totally doesn't want? Like he laid it out to her with me on the phone, and we continued on with investing the way he wanted. And it was really a help.
Yes. And, unfortunately, what you see a lot of times, and this is even, you typically have one spouse, whether it's transitioning to the next generation, the wealth, or whether it's a spouse, you typically have one spouse that handles everything, or that is the way it is in a lot of cases. And it becomes very difficult if you go into retirement with the same process. I think it's very important to have, communication is essential. It is the foundation of a relationship, I think.
Yeah.
And really, without proper communication, it just creates, between money and communication, you can just throw it out the window in terms of divorce and just scorched earth, I would say. And, I look at, especially starting out, that often is not thought that much about, but you have a couple, they're starting out and they usually don't talk about money right away. And I think because people are getting married later now, there's probably a greater focus on that. But what you end up in a situation is you have people raise completely different viewpoints on money, and then merging everything together. And to think that there's not going to be problems there, there are. And really, a retirement, I look at it kind of similar in the fact that, you haven't, a lot of people really don't, they just get used to a certain way of budgeting and they don't really think about it. So starting out, you budget, you have to learn how to do that and work through that. At a certain point, it just becomes second nature. But then you hit retirement, you don't have the income coming in. So you really need to revisit budgeting. And that's where it gets into just communication, which oftentimes, as you mentioned, can be a lost art.
Yeah. And, to your point, if you have those budgeting in retirement conversations long before you're actually retired, I mean, that's kind of a shocker. Or if you do a budget after retirement and realize, oh, my whole lifestyle is about to change, yeah, I mean, you want
We
to have those.
unfortunately have, you put inflation and longevity together, and they are it used to be I would talk about inflation and I would have to bring up, the payphone or you get into these things, the stamp, you can go up and people understood. Now everyone understands inflation. So that's definitely something that everyone's aware of. And then you get into longevity. It's very difficult with retirement planning because no one knows how long they're going to live. They don't know what their expenses are really going to be as you get into healthcare, especially if you haven't done long-term care planning. It can be extremely expensive, especially with two spouses. The likelihood, probably about 75 to 80% of one of them having a long-term care issue. So how do you handle that? And it's oftentimes no one wants to think about that. But if you have time ahead of retirement where you can talk through that, really it'll help put some of the pieces at least together of your puzzle.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on long-term care insurance?
So I think what you want to do is you definitely want to look at you want to get it typically early, and you want to understand what it covers. And that's really the biggest thing. You definitely want to make sure it covers home care. You want to make sure you understand if there's inflation involved, getting back to inflation. And you don't, if you turn all of the money over to, if you say, I'm just going to pay for the gold platinum plan, you're going to pay a lot. So really it's a matter of balance with any type of coverage, where you have to take into account your other income sources, and you really use it to supplement that in a long-term care issue. I think, if you can start around the time that you're thinking about retiring, 3 to 5 years before that, that's optimal. And really look in, what's your health, what are your circumstances, and really you really work from there. And just because someone, they say, well, neither of my parents, they're still alive, they've never had any issues. Well, that can change on a dime, for their parents as well as for them.
Yeah, that's what happened to me. My parents were completely fine, but quite old actually, but completely fine, driving, functioning, didn't need me for anything. And within 2 weeks, they weren't doing any of that anymore. And nobody saw it coming, you know. And of course, where they lived was set up for young people, it wasn't set up for needing care after the fact. And, anyway, you're exactly right. I love that you had a little bullet here on your one sheet that said financial freedom begins when you stop chasing perfect, which I'm curious about because I agree with you, but I want to know.
No, so we would say, I don't know if it was, I have to think about the person that said perfect is the enemy of great or good. And really nothing, especially when you have a couple, each person's version of perfect is completely different. And it's really a matter of really laying it out. I would almost I call it in the book a financial life inventory plan. The purpose of it is really to take a step back from your life and really inventory everything. And I always say, over a period of 25, 30 years, you can collect things. It's like moving, but it's a moving like you've never done before in terms of your finances, everything, and really looking at how does everything work together and what makes the most sense for you and your spouse, or just you. But don't pay attention to what your colleague, your friend, different people have different viewpoints and completely different life expectations and just financial resources. And that's why it's so important really to take your individualized situation into account, and really, whether it's Medicare, Social Security, all these things, there's a lot of gotchas and there's not a whole lot of do-overs. And that's what I always tell people.
Yeah, I was surprised. And do you help people with Medicare and Social Security? Because there are decisions to make there. And
Yes. And I mean, a common decision that I see, one of the biggest decisions I see is that even if you're still working, you say, well, I'm just going to go on to Medicare at 65, because there's a perception that you've paid into Medicare your whole life. So one might expect it to be free in retirement. Well, it's anything but that. And, again, really understanding, even if you're still working and you plan to work into your 70s, getting into, if it's a business owner, a person that is independent, self-employed, they really understand, well, I can continue to work, but what's my exit strategy if I have a health issue that comes up? And that is more the role where somebody gets into their late 60s, 70s, and they have to just transition without really, people say, well, I'm just going to sell it, my business. Well, it may be a terrible time to do that. So, doing the proper planning really avoids a disaster in some cases with your biggest asset, in the case of a business.
hmm yeah, yeah, there's so many factors. It is very interesting to, I mean, Medicare also, what I found, I mean, we have businesses, so health insurance was always insanely expensive. There was private insurance. It was, I would get the bill every month and think, how do people pay this? And, but so, I kind of looked forward to going on to Medicare, which I did recently. But those prices keep going up.
Yes.
At least with my Blue Shield, it would only go up, go up enormously about once a year. And Medicare is just sort of I've been surprised that it started out great, but, it just keeps rising.
Yeah, and there's also a thing called IRMA that catches a lot of people off guard in terms of their income. If you make above a certain amount of money, you're subject to IRMA. So in some cases, you can pay a lot more. It's a 2-year look back on it, meaning that they take your income from 2 years ago, for example, this year. So it gets extremely complicated. And that's the thing even with Medicare, I'm like, at some point, they're going to have a plan double Y or something, because of just how they've they're just adding plans, and it just makes a very confusing decision process. And if you don't do the right things as you approach these dates, you just really open yourself up for some really, pretty bad mistakes. Social Security is another one that I see a lot, where people just say, I'm going to take it when I can get it. And, you have to really look at, in some cases, if you're still working, you're not getting, if your income is above a very small amount, you're not going to get anything. So you have to, really look, and you eventually get back the credits and everything. But you can't just go in thinking that just because someone next door did something or they're suggesting it. And that's the other thing, with Google and these other websites, they're great for information, but a lot of times things are sponsored. Someone's trying to sell you a product, or they're trying to make you do something so that they can get something else from a different direction. And that's really important to be mindful of when you look at some of the search engines that are out there.
Yeah, yeah, that's challenging. I try to stay away, to some extent, because it does boggle your mind a bit. And people have arguments for, the opposite sides of things that both make sense. So there are great arguments for taking your Social Security as soon as you can, and there are great arguments for not, and then you just leave confused and do nothing.
And you really, we say it's everything, the decision process really in the weeds, if you will. But really what you want to do is like take it early. Well, if you have health issues and you expect to have a shorter life expectancy, then it can make sense. But for a lot of people, especially the higher earning spouse, if it's a couple, they really want to they should consider delaying, because the chances of one of them living into their mid to late 80s or 90s is probably pretty significant. And that increased amount is significant because not only is it a larger amount you're starting with, but it's also typically going to be increased for inflation. So the number's going up at a much higher number as well, because you're starting at a higher point.
Yeah, and you've talked about making sure that you know your own lifestyle and yourself, basically. And people will say, well, you can take it and invest it and you'll make more and whatever, but you have to know yourself. I mean, they say that about taxes as well. But if you're not a person who's really going to come through on that one, then you're just going to spend it.
Yeah, and that's what's the other thing I always come back with is people always say, well, what is my number, or what is the thing that I need to be at to retire? And the answer is, it's hard to say because everyone is different. And again, it really has to do with what your debt, your goals are in retirement. If you're looking to travel around the world and you're going to do that consistently, well, you need to have some money put aside for that specific purpose, because if you don't, the rest of everything is going to collapse at some point.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I want to make sure we talk about your book. So, The Future Is Now. And how new is that? Or
so I had a book, or I do have a book, and it's an introductory guide to finances for young adults. And so I came out with that last April. And so that's out on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you would buy a book.
Right.
And it's mainly for young adults, whether they're coming out of high school, college, really as a guide, because like I mentioned before, you're expected to make all these decisions with no real education. And I, because of my background, I went in the Army to pay off my student loans because I just had a huge amount of student loans and really no real experience to get something that would put me in a position to be, I think, successful. So the Army had a program where they paid off the loans. So I'm very sensitive to someone starting out, because I was the first one to go to college in my family, really didn't have a good direction. And now I look back and I would say, well, if someone's starting out, whether you're a grandparent, you're their parent, you want them not only to use you as a resource, but you want them to find mentors, and you want them to try things out, whether it's through an internship, I always say, if someone wants to be a medical professional, they should really consider doing volunteering in high school at a hospital, because they may find out they hate blood. which
Right.
wouldn't be in most cases good. So, that's that book. The new book really is for people approaching retirement, pre-retirees and retirees. And really what I tried to do was create a roadmap that would help someone try to put all the pieces together and really understand, not in granular detail where you're just getting into situations where you get more confused than where you started, but really to provide an overview at a high level that makes someone more comfortable with these decisions, but also at the same time pointing out that it's important really to look at everything, your assets, your liabilities, what your expectations are in retirement. What are you looking to volunteer? I have a whole chapter just talking about what is your, what really your health, your goals. I think it's extremely important to lay out goals before you go starting to do the retirement planning process, and really communicating that, whether you have an accountability partner, if you're an individual, or with spouses, or even having accountability partner with a spouse. And we would say in some cases, the financial advisor in certain cases is really the accountability partner to get, the individuals or families through the planning process. And what I've tried to do is use in both books examples of things that work well and things that don't. And we always say people learn from stories,
Yeah.
and they learn from other people's mistakes. And so that's where I've tried to lay out with both books.
I love that. And I love both. I really love that you're trying to help young people, because while we learn from our mistakes, I think that's a sad way that we do money in our country, is like make a whole bunch of mistakes. And then at 45, you've learned a few things, and, you've lost so much time, and money and time are just really connected.
No, and I mean, I look at home formation. That is the indication of what there's a lot of things that matter, where you don't have people forming families because they just can't afford it, and they're trying to figure out how they can get their debt or to try to get in a better position. And I've said, if you have someone that is financially literate coming out of high school, going into college, technical school, or whatever they do,
Right.
they're going to be miles ahead. It's, I look at life going from the start through retirement really as a marathon, and different people, fortunately for the people, unfortunately for a lot of people, they start out at a different spot. They just stand there, and you get other people that are 3 or 4, 6, 12 miles ahead of them.
Right.
And the system doesn't do it does a lot of people a disservice as it relates to looking at student loans, looking at just how, credit cards. If you go to a college outside the bookstore, there's credit card offer. It is just inundate you. And you look at the cap, all these card companies, and the kids, you can go both ways with whether responsibility and everything. But if you're coming just completely oblivious, it creates its own set of, issues that when you figure out what's going on, oftentimes it's too late to course correct.
Yeah, and you can't really be held accountable to being responsible for something nobody ever teaches you. And maybe you're doing exactly what your parents did, but they didn't know what they were doing. So you're making the same, mistakes, trying to be responsible, but it wasn't the right thing to be doing in the first place. So uh
You know?
challenging. Yeah.
And I always go back to communicating, whether you're starting out, whether you're working. The one thing I learned in the military was that it's essential to communicate. And if you make a mistake, you own the mistake, you work through that, and everyone is in a better spot. Because that's the thing that's unfortunate. I think that it's easy to make mistakes. It seems like it's even harder these days to kind of own up to them.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there's an awareness level too. You have to be involved with your money. I mean,
Mm.
it's easy enough to accept that credit card, and sometimes that's even wise to help you build your credit to have a credit
Mhm.
card. But if you don't know what you're doing, and you're not paying attention, so you go from a zero balance to a $10,000 balance before you even know it, and you're not even paying attention till you start getting. That's the thing where if they have the literacy from an early age, they'll know to be on the lookout. They'll get the app so they can see what they're spending, and they'll,
Ex-
because we can't just, avoid it, basically.
No, and in the book for the young adults, I really lay out, how do they even figure out your credit score? It's like out of some sort of, it's out of some sort of maze where they come out with it. I also talk about just credit cards. As you mentioned, I don't think debt is bad if it's used appropriately, but you really have to go in eyes wide open because unfortunately, in order oftentimes to build your credit, you have to have debt to build that. But by having that, it creates its own set of problems in terms of just getting in over your head.
Right, right. Yeah, I love both, and I agree with you. I think bottom line with all of this is communication, and I think that is how you build relationships, whether it's human relationships or even your relationship with money. I mean,
Mhm.
not necessarily talking to your money, but you are interacting with it, and maybe you are
Yes.
talking to it. But
Yes.
you have to communicate even with yourself or with your advisors and your tax people, and I mean, you've got to learn and
Mhm.
um, it's the communication piece I really loved because especially for couples, if you are in this sort of, if your relationship with money is one where you kind of abdicate responsibility and the other spouse or partner or whoever can just take it on and you don't even know what's going on, um, that's not going to work well, now is not going to work well in retirement either. Because that whole being retired and having that freedom, you're never going to really feel that because you're not going to really know what's happening and you're not in control. So, and
Yeah.
only one person's making decisions, and that doesn't create a good dynamic at all.
No, and I see that a lot where you have, people have, we always use the beach or the mountains where they just, they fantasize about it while they're working in their work life that they want to just go there. And one of the spouses just is happy staying where they're at, or they look at one wants to go to the mountains, one wants to go to the beach. And in the end, the dominant spouse typically wins. But what I see a lot of times, they just don't do the most important thing is not to go there on a weekend and say this place is great. It's really to really live there for a month, 2 months, and try out 3 or 4 similar places and really see which one really fits you. And it's a good idea if you can slowly, not in retirement, but as you approach retirement and maybe you're slowing down working, it's not a bad idea to maybe remote given all the opportunity and see how that works from different places that you may want to live, but do it in a fashion where both of you are on the same page. And it's just not like, you start, one of the spouses starts packing boxes and the other one's like, where are we going?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree, and if you don't communicate, that one spouse packing the boxes might just think that you're
Mhm.
cool with it and you wanna be doing this, and, so I think the 2 themes here, communication is just huge, and also I love the idea of trying things out.
Mhm.
I think my parents always did that, we moved a lot, and they always would rent in whatever new city it was
Mhm.
until they figured out the city and where they really wanted to be to buy, and it was kind of annoying to be staying in rentals for a little while till we figured things out, but it was smart, and where they ended up was typically not the place they would have ended up if they hadn't done that.
Exactly. And I always say, I'm in Atlanta, so I see people that move here and they're say, well, it's only 20 minutes away. Well, at rush hour, that it takes a life of its own where they end up in traffic for an hour and a half, sitting there wondering why they didn't probably, drive around during a workday.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, okay. So Jeff, how can people can buy your book, The Future is Now, and then how else can they connect with you?
Sure. So my firm's name is Balance Wealth Partners. So I have a website for that. That is that name. I also, as you met, it's jeffreypanic.com. Panic, no C, but with a K. So a little bit different. But I have a website there that has all the book information, everything, helpful videos, trying to just design to provide information.
Yeah, that's great. So really it sounds like the goal is to help people well, on the early side to just get that financial education that everybody needs and on the later side to retire as well as possible for who they are.
Yeah, they always say, that you want to retire on your own terms. That's like a quote, but at the end of the day, how do you do that? It's just not something that is where it's not a one size fits all where everybody has the same same family situation, same savings, same debt, and just layers upon layers, and people just shut down. And then it becomes like we mentioned, where you're on your heels, reactive, and you just end up in a situation where you're worse than you were when you were working.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you can answer that question of how do we do this, because almost the whole financial industry is full of these terms that sound great, or these stories, success stories about people. But you're right. Everybody's just listening to this going, that sounds amazing. How do I do it? So having somebody like you who can guide that, I don't think we're very good at doing it on our own.
It's just it's almost like it's just very difficult because there's so many moving parts
Yeah.
and things are constantly changing and evolving, which is the other thing.
Yeah.
So it's
Right now.
mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I love this conversation. And, you know, you, like most of the guests coming on here, pretty much all of them are very invested in helping people. There's much less about selling a product and much more about, you're using what you've seen and your experience and your knowledge to help people live their best lives. So I really appreciate that. And thank you for coming on and sharing.
I really appreciate you having me and enjoyed the conversation.
No, thank you. Okay, well, this was great. And audience, thank you so much for listening to the Money and You Show. Please subscribe, rate and review the show. All of that helps us to continue to bring great guests like Jeffrey Panic onto the show. And all of this is for your financial education. It's a pretty broad array of topics. And I really feel like if a great relationship with money is about learning more and interacting more, this gives you a launch pad, at least, to find what interests you and what you need to learn more about and who you can go to for the resources that you need. So thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week.